Li Yang and Li Yu brought Yi Futian back to a private residence on Emperor Li's road. Li Yang and Li Yu brought Yi Futian back to a private residence on Emperor Li's road. Would you like me to station some people here? Li Yu asked Yi Futian. Li Xian may have promised not to do anything, but he had done so unwillingly. No need. If Li Xian were willing to trade his life for mine, he would have asked Yan Yuan for help, said Yi Futian. He had just gotten back. Who besides Li Xian would be trying to kill him? And Li Xian was not that stupid, especially because he thought that Li Xian's acting against him back there had been premeditated. He was not a simple scion of a noble house. Even though he had compromised in the end, all the time that Yi Futian had been pressing his sword into his throat, he had been extremely calm. All right. Be careful, master, said Li Yu. But if you can, you should go to Sword Mountain to cultivate. She naturally meant well. All Yi Futian had to do was nod, and he would be able to go to Sword Mountain to cultivate. Because of the involvement of Sword Mountain, Li Xian did not dare to do anything rash against Yi Futian. After all, that was the foremost holy land for swordsmanship in the Dali dynasty, similar to Lihan Heaven in Emperor Xia's realm. The master of Sword Mountain was a saint at the fourth there of the Saint Plane, Nirvana, and he truly stood at the peak of the people in the Dali dynasty. There were few people like him. I will think about it carefully, said Yi Futian. Li Yang and Li Yu said farewell and left. After they left, Yi Futian sat down in the courtyard and closed his eyes to cultivate. Today's events had made him more vigilant. After coming to Dali, he had observed the situation and been cautious. He had not gotten into conflicts of interest with those who he could not compete with. And if he had been a bit arrogant, saint-level figures were too high above him to care about it. And even if they did care, they wouldn't kill him over it. But the affair with Li Xian had made him understand that here in the power center of Dali Imperial City, sometimes even when he did nothing, disasters could still befall him. Actually, this was not only true of Emperor Li's realm. The whole world was like this. Those who had cultivated weakly would die when battles broke out between powerful figures, and they would not even know why they were dying. Thus, there was only one way to avoid these threats that you could not see coming. Make yourself stronger. If he had not had enough combat power today, the saint would have directly killed him. He had truly wanted to slay him. Li Xian had not been joking. Thus, he had used his combat prowess to capture Li Xian with his sword and avoid danger. If he became a saint, then killing him would not be something that a saint at the first tier of the saint plane could do. However, the gap between sage and saint was extremely difficult to cross. It was like a moat. Many people were stopped on one side of it, and even if they worked their whole lives, they would never be able to cross it. Yi Futian pushed away these distracting thoughts and closed his eyes. It seemed there was a rustling sound ringing out through his life palace. The world tree was swaying and giving off jade-green light. Many patterns were blooming around the tree. They were other life spirits. The world tree's light flowed towards his body and then spread out into the distance. Suddenly, Yi Futian felt that he had turned into a tree. His every thought and every piece of his aura were branches stretching out into the distance, to touch the essence of nature, heaven and earth. He could feel the power of heaven and earth. Man was modeled after heaven, after earth, after the path. And the path was modeled after nature. A marvelous airflow swept out from him and was immersed in his cultivation. When he had fought Yuan Jin at the Battle of Empty Realm, he had also entered this mysterious plane where he could sense the power of the great path. Since man made the path was an extension of man's will. Of course, to actually extend one's will was too hard. Yi Futian's perception was not strong enough right now. But by plunging himself into the path of the sword, he could already create many kinds of swords. He could gain a name for himself with his swords and thus walk around in Dali. The seventh swordsman was a powerful fighter, but that was, in fact, an illusion. Many months had passed since he had cultivated the Taishan Sword Sutra. Although his swordsmanship was already exquisite, he was more integrated with the power of multiple elements, and combined with the other skills he had learned while cultivating, he could unleash outstandingly powerful swords. Of course, his sword itself was not too bad. The Taishan Sword Sutra provided a general outline for his swordsmanship. He had cultivated many elemental powers, but he had truly cultivated different types of elemental sword magic. He had been able to apply these many kinds of abilities to his sword, so his swordsmanship alone was quite formidable. But if he could integrate the power he had before into his swordsmanship, it would naturally be even stronger. Now he needed to forge an even more powerful sword so that he could truly make a name for himself with it, and create a foothold in Dali. Futian did not go out for a while. He stayed in his residence, cultivating. However, Seventh Swordsman's name began to circulate in the outside world. Dali Academy had a prestigious place in Emperor Li's realm, and so the things that had happened were passed along quite quickly. Moreover, since the first person who Lu Chuan had brought from the lower worlds to cultivate, the Prince Regent's grandson, and Yen Yuan had all been there, it would have been impossible for the news not to spread. Many people in Emperor Xiao's realm were curious the first time that Seventh Swordsman's name spread throughout the upper worlds. How strong was this man from the lower worlds who dared to stand directly outside Dali Academy and seek the path? Li Xian had ruined Seventh Swordsman's battles for seeking the path. If he had been able to continue, a much stronger disciple from Dali Academy would have come out, and then they would have been able to see. After a few days, some more slightly shocking news came out. And there were two sides to this news. The first was that a swordsman had come from 1,000 miles away in the primary holy land for swordsmanship in Dali Imperial City, Sword Mountain. It seemed that he had come for an appointment and had met with Seventh Swordsman by chance. The reason that this was shocking was that the one who had come from Sword Mountain was Jian Wu, who was called the most outstanding disciple among the younger generation of Sword Mountain. He was at the limit of what was possible below the saint level. Once upon a time, many people had wanted to see a battle between Jian Wu and Yuan Jin, and had speculated about who was stronger between them. However, Yuan Jin had fallen, and Dong Chun would probably take his place and become the personal disciple of the imperial advisor. Who was stronger, Dong Chun or Jian Wu of Sword Mountain? But Jian Wu's reason for coming was not Dong Chun of Dali Academy, but Seventh Swordsman. From this, it could be seen that Sword Mountain thought highly of this junior swordsman who had come from the lower worlds. Indeed, he had made Jian Wu come off the mountain. The second reason the news was shocking was very similar to the first reason. It was because someone else had come to Dali Imperial City who was almost a saint. It was Di Hao of Dali Mountain. King Tiandao had always been overtly in conflict with the imperial advisor. The imperial advisor had founded Dali Academy, and so King Tiandao had founded Dali Mountain in the west as a holy land for cultivating. Not long ago, the imperial advisor had announced that he recalled his disciples. Now, the disciples of Dali Mountain were coming from far away. This made people speculate wildly. And the one who had come was Di Hao. King Tiandao controlled the Western army, and all of the disciples of Dali Mountain had battle experience. They were all geniuses forged in the fires of battle. Di Hao had the honor of being the best disciple of Dali Mountain. King Tiandao thought very highly of him and had adopted him. So, how could someone like this coming to Dali Imperial City not cause a great disturbance? Especially since Jian Wu of Sword Mountain had also come. At that time, Yuan Jin and Dong Chun of Dali Academy, Di Hao of Dali Mountain, and Jian Wu of Sword Mountain were the best that there was below the saint level, and the most prestigious people at that level in the Dali dynasty. Yuan Jin had gone to the Battle of Empty Realm, but Dong Chun had not. As for Jian Wu, the imperial advisor had not wanted to order him to go, and had wanted even less to have Di Hao go. Generally speaking, the imperial advisor's household was responsible for commanding the Battle of Empty Realm, and one of his disciples was always there. And it would obviously not be suitable for the imperial advisor's people to show up at the same place as King Tiandao's people. The three strongest figures in the Dali dynasty below the saint level were all in Dali Imperial City. Even though they weren't saints, they still attracted a lot of attention, and people had great expectations for them. Many people even wondered if the three of them would stand upon the same stage in battle. They would be able to see which one of them was worthy of being called the greatest figure in Dali Imperial City below the saint level. As for Seventh Swordsman, he was naturally overlooked. Even though he had gained a little bit of fame outside Dali Academy, he was still not worth looking at when compared to those three. How could the foremost person from the lower worlds compare with the strongest people from the upper worlds? Many people even argued about how many sword strokes Seventh Swordsman could last at Jian Wu's hands. As Dali Imperial City was being shocked by these two pieces of news, Futian was improving his swordsmanship at his residence. He sat there cross-legged with an old tree beside him. The tree was swaying, and its leaves were falling off and swirling around Futian. They seemed to circle him in some sort of majestic pattern. What was more incredible was that each leaf seemed extremely sharp. At that moment, Futian suddenly opened his eyes. The leaves suddenly flew wildly as a terrible shriek rang out all around. The sound was ear-piercing, and the leaves all flashed in the same direction, seeming to cut through space itself. Slash! A wall was cut through piece by the leaves, and the whole thing crumbled to the ground. A vertical line appeared where the leaves had cut through, and on the other side of the wall, several figures appeared. The leaves flew back to Futian and drifted behind him. "Your sword of raging storms is becoming as pure as flame," said Liu with a smile. "Why have you come?" asked Futian with a bow. "You have been staying here practicing swordsmanship for several days, so you probably don't know what has happened in the outside world. You have a meeting with the shadow-bearing sword saint, who has just arrived in Dali Imperial City. And the most outstanding disciple of Sword Mountain Jianwu has also come," said Liu. "Oh," Futian nodded. It seemed that the shadow-bearing sword saint wanted to take him to Sword Mountain as a disciple. Otherwise, he would not have been so considerate. "You have been at peace here, but you don't know the disturbances that have taken place outside. Jianwu is the best swordsman of Sword Mountain below the saint level. And not only that, he is one of the strongest people below the saint level in Dali Dynasty. The fact that the shadow-bearing sword saint brought him here means that he firmly wants to defeat you and bring you back to Sword Mountain with him," said Liu with a smile. "It would be good if Futian went to Sword Mountain. Sword Mountain was the best place for practicing swordsmanship for those below the saint level." At that moment, Futian thought of Wang Chuan. But this time he would compete with his opponent with his sword. Chapter 1109. The Three Great Holy Lands for Cultivation in Dali. Futian saw Liu's smile and said, "If I am defeated, then I will fulfill my promise and go to Sword Mountain to practice my swordsmanship." Liu nodded. Sword Mountain is the best place in the Dali Dynasty to practice swordsmanship. If you were to go there to train, you wouldn't have to go to Dali Academy like last time. Liu was certain that Futian would be defeated. No matter how strong he was, his opponent was stronger. He was the foremost junior of Sword Mountain. Futian nodded slightly and didn't say any more arrogant things. If he gave it his all, he believed that he could defeat anyone in Dali below the saint level. But right now, he could only do it via his swordsmanship, and he had placed many constraints on himself. If he wanted to win, he could only do so with his sword. If he could not win with his sword, then even if he could defeat his opponent, he still could not win. If he won with his sword, then he won. If he lost with his sword, then he lost. If he faced an opponent like Wang Chuan, he still did not genuinely have absolute assurance of victory with his sword alone. "Oh right, one more thing. But it doesn't have much to do with you. Are you interested in hearing it?" asked Liu with a smile. "Please tell me," said Futian with a nod. "Jianwu is not the only one to come to Dali Imperial City now. Dihao from Dali Mountain has come as well," she said. "Dihao?" asked Futian confused. He knew of Dali Mountain. The records told him that it had been founded by King Tiandao, who controlled the Western Army. At the moment, there are three powerful holy lands for cultivation in the Dali Dynasty: Dali Academy, Dali Mountain, and Sword Mountain, said Liu slowly. Dali Imperial City is not among them, but in the eyes of the dynasty, it lies at the center of these three holy lands. Dali Academy, which was founded by the Imperial Advisor, is there. Since it receives the full support of His Majesty and has the advantage of being located in the Imperial City, it is considered the best of the three holy lands. The second best is Dali Mountain. King Tiandao has been stationed in the west for many years, and the Western Army completely controls that area. King Tiandao's household holds absolute power in the west. Many families and sects look to them for leadership. Given this background, King Tiandao was able to leverage the power he held in the west to call together all the young geniuses and found Dali Mountain. All the disciples of Dali Mountain have experience on the field of battle. That is how Dali Mountain, which is the foremost holy land in the west and the second best in all the land. The third best holy land for cultivating is Sword Mountain. Dihao comes from Dali Mountain, and King Tiandao has adopted him. Many people look at him as the future king of the West. He has never been the Dali imperial city before, and the great figures of the city have no concrete information about his power. Still, many people speculate that he is the strongest person in the Dali dynasty below the saint level. None of the disciples of Dali Academy can defeat him? Asked Yi Futian curiously. Dongchan of Dali Academy is indeed very strong. Now that the imperial advisor is going to choose another disciple, Dongchan is probably best qualified for the spot. Many people think it will be him. His strength is obvious, but King Tiandao is very conceited and arrogant. He probably sent Di Hao to Dali Imperial City to attack the cultivators that the Imperial Advisor has summoned. You can see the trust he puts in Di Hao, said Li Yu. Thus, there are those who call Di Hao the most powerful figure in the Dali dynasty below the saint level. Of course, some think it is Dongchan. But without a doubt, one must add Jianwu to that list. They are certainly the three most powerful figures below the saint level in the Dali dynasty, and the most famous. And no, they will all be together in Dali Imperial City. But Li Yu looked at Yi Futian and smiled. If you can defeat Jianwu, you will be one of the top three. Of course, she was being polite. In reality, she didn't think Yi Futian could defeat Jianwu. Yi Futian smiled and said nothing. Li Yu took her leave saying, I will return. If there is more news, I will come tell you. You can just send someone to tell me, said Yi Futian. Very well. It's also possible that the people from Sword Mountain will personally visit us, said Li Yu with a nod. She couldn't keep coming here all the time. After Li Yu left, Yi Futian continued cultivating, doing all he could to integrate his power into his sword. He used Taishian Sword Sutra to temper his sword. The next time he faced a powerful foe, it wouldn't be like it had been in the lower worlds. Jianwu of Sword Mountain was ranked in the top 3 figures below the saint level in the Dali dynasty. The cultivators from Dali Mountain and Sword Mountain were arriving at Dali Imperial City one by one. The commotion shook the city at the center of the Dali dynasty. Everyone was waiting for some news. They did not have to wait too long. Soon, the people from Dali Mountain went to pay a visit to Dali Academy, and arranged to go to Dali Academy again in 7 days to seek the path. Dali Mountain wanted to come into conflict with Dali Academy openly. And just like Yi Futian, they said they were seeking the path, just because it sounded good. In reality, they were challenging them to battle. The 2 most powerful holy lands of the Dali dynasty were in open conflict. This was King Tiandao provoking the imperial advisor. He wanted to prove that Dali Mountain trained better disciples than Dali Academy. Since Di Hao had come, many people expected that they would get to see the battle between him and Dongchan. Many people thought about what it would be like if Di Hao defeated Dongchan. Would the imperial advisor's authority come under threat? Just as people were becoming worried about the imperial advisor, some news came from his household. In 7 days, the imperial advisor would personally come to Dali Academy, and he had invited all the top figures of Dali Imperial City to go and observe the forum. Even Sword Mountain was on the list of those invited, and on that day he would choose his next disciple. There was a great stir in Dali Imperial City as the news spread. This was the imperial advisor's manner. Just as many people were worried about him and were afraid that he would be defeated, he had said that he would personally observe the battle and choose a disciple. No matter if he won or lost, he had shown himself to be 2 steps ahead of everyone else. On the 2nd day, news also came from Sword Mountain. Jianwu would invite someone to go to the forum at Dali Academy with him. 7th Swordsman. Suddenly 7th Swordman's name was once again ringing throughout Dali Imperial City. The strongest cultivators of the younger generation of Sword Mountain, Jianwu, had challenged 7th Swordsman. The time. The day of the forum between Dali Academy and Dali Mountain. The place. Dali Academy. This news caused great waves and shocked all the people in Dali Imperial City. They were now full of great expectations for the forum in several days. Not only Dali Academy and Dali Mountain would be attending, but Sword Mountain would also be there and would fight with 7th Swordsman. The 3 greatest holy lands in the Dali dynasty would all be there, and so would the 3 strongest cultivators in the Dali dynasty below the saint level. On that day, Yi Futian was still in the residence where he was staying, tempering his sword. At that moment he had a slightly strange feeling. He opened his eyes and looked up into the distant sky. He saw a group of swordsmen flying over, and they landed outside his residence. "Greetings, seventh swordsman," came a voice from outside. "Please come in," said Futian. As he said this, the group of cultivators flew in and descended into the courtyard. They all looked at Futian, who was sitting there, cultivating. "I come in the name of the shadow-bearing sword saint with news. In 5 days, Sword Mountain will await you at Dali Academy. Please keep your promise," one of them said. Futian already knew from Liu that Jianwu would be there, so he knew what the promise the man had mentioned was about. But he was a little surprised about the location. It would be at Dali Academy. "All right. Please tell the shadow-bearing sword saint that I will be there on time," answered Futian. "Very well. Farewell." The man nodded, and then the group of them flew up into the sky and disappeared in a flash. Not long after they left, Liu arrived and told him what had happened outside. This made Futian anticipate what would happen in 5 days at Dali Academy. The 3 strongest people in the Dali dynasty below the saint level would all be there together. The days finally passed as everyone in the city waited expectantly. On that day, powerful figures were continuously descending from the sky outside of Dali Academy. Some of them rode on swords, others on carriages. Some of the figures who were coming down from their carriages had powerful auras. Many people from the imperial family have come. Everyone's hearts trembled. It seemed that the imperial family was quite interested in this forum. A dragon roared in the sky, as a divine golden dragon came pulling a carriage. Several gold-robed figures were on the carriage. Everyone gasped as they saw them. It was not just people from the imperial family who had come, as even the prince of the Dali dynasty had come to Dali Academy. If Futian had seen this, he would have realized that the person on the carriage was the one that he had come to this place for. It was Li Yao, the prince of Dali Imperial City. The huge golden dragon descended outside Dai Academy, and the carriage came to the ground. The prince stepped into the academy, but no one came out to greet him. The imperial advisor had founded Dali Academy, and had desired to train the best fighters of the Dali dynasty there. When he first founded it, His Majesty Emperor Li had once ordered people to build a statue outside the academy, a statue of the imperial advisor, highlighting his powerful position. However, when the imperial advisor found out about this, he had personally requested that the statue be torn down. Emperor Li had agreed, and the imperial advisor had destroyed the statue with his own hands. He had declared that Dali Academy did not advocate advancing the individual, but was to be a place for training cultivators for the Dali dynasty. There was no rank or authority here. Everyone who entered the academy was equal. However, after that day, the people of the Dali dynasty's respect for the imperial advisor only grew stronger. After this, His Majesty Emperor Li had personally ordered that anyone who entered Dali Academy must come down from their carriage. They could not rudely fly in, not even princes and princesses. Afterward, Emperor Li had made the princes and princesses go to Dali Academy to cultivate. Thus, now that Li Yao and his entourage had arrived, they still had to get out of their carriage, even though they were royalty. They had to walk into Dali Academy, and there was no one there to welcome them. This was Dali Academy, the foremost holy land for cultivating in the Dali dynasty. But today Dali Mountain was coming there to seek the path. All the disciples of Dali Academy were gathered together, having shown up for the sparring session. There were many disciples on both sides of the area, but they were behaving in an orderly manner, casually chatting and occasionally casting glances off into the distance. All the disciples of Dali Academy were gathered together, having shown up for the sparring session. There were many disciples on both sides of the area, but they were behaving in an orderly manner, casually chatting and occasionally casting glances off into the distance. There were many seats on the steps in front of the sparring session platform that had been prepared for many of the elders that had come here today. There were already many more elders of Dali Academy waiting here than usual, and they were all looking off into the distance as well. The great disciple of Dali Academy, Yan Yuan, was already there. Li Yao and his entourage approached from the distance, coming in front of the building. They bowed slightly to Yan Yuan, and the many saints of Dali Academy and called, "Greetings, sirs." Yan Yuan was usually responsible for events held at Dali Academy, and thus he was seated in the highest position. "Please have a seat, Your Highness," said Yin Yuan with a slight smile. Li Yao and the others nodded, and 3 of them stepped forward and were seated. Afterward, more and more people arrived, many of whom were of the imperial family. There were many people of Emperor Li's bloodline in the city. Other than the few kings who had been given their titles by His Majesty himself, many others had been born into the imperial household. At that moment, many people were clustering around a single person. He was wearing a golden robe, and Li Xian stood by his side. Li Su was Li Xian's elder brother, and the Prince Regent's grandson, and had the highest status of the royal grandsons. Many people thought that he would one day inherit the Prince Regent's mantle. The Prince Regent's position in the imperial family was extremely high. After all, he was the emperor's uncle, and so he was highly respected. King Tiandao was extremely powerful, but he was His Majesty's brother. In some sense, King Tiandao and the emperor were the closest, being of such close blood. He did not bother to get closer to other members of the imperial family, and since he was in the west, the Prince Regent had gradually become the leader of the imperial family. As for King Li, although he was a king, not many people cared about him. His status was not very high. King Li was the weakest of the 4 kings, and so he had the lowest position. Although relationships between members of the imperial family were slightly delicate, Emperor Li did not care. This was the world of cultivators after all. If they didn't gang up and form cliques, how could they have any power? As long as the members of the imperial household did not do anything too improper and stayed within the rules, Emperor Li would not bother with their affairs. Emperor Li would not even ask questions about the conflict between King Tiandao and the imperial advisor. A little benign competition was not a bad thing for Emperor Li. And King Tiandao and the imperial advisor both had a sense of propriety. Li Xian, I heard that several days ago, someone put a sword up to your throat. If Yin Yuan had not shown up, perhaps you would have been slain? Said a voice. Everyone looked up to where it had come from. The speaker was a young man next to Li Yao, who was wearing bright and beautiful robes. He looked a lot like Li Yao and was clearly someone extraordinary. And his aura was mighty. He was clearly at a very high level. This naturally another prince, Li Sun. He was Li Yao's brother and a saint-level figure. There was a bit of mockery in his words. Li Xian was of the same generation as these princes, but they were not very close. Li Xian naturally did not dare to be as arrogant as he usually was in the face of this opponent. He looked a bit embarrassed. He bowed slightly to Li Sun and said, "Your Highness, it was because I was too generous." "I think it was because you were too arrogant," said Li Sun with a smile. "He had come to Dali Academy to seek the path, and you tried to kill him. What a temper you have. But in the end he got you. How does that feel?" Li Xian nodded. This matter had indeed been very shameful. "You'll have to cultivate more in the future and spend less time stirring up trouble," said Li Sun. He then looked at Li Su beside him. "Li Su, make sure to teach this guy well from now on. He's outrageous." "All right." Li Su nodded and bowed to Yin Yuan. "I apologize for disturbing you with this matter, sir." "It's no problem," answered Yin Yuan indifferently. He looked at Li Xian and saw him bowing his head. He was clearly uncomfortable right now. "Dongchen is here," came a call. A group of figures appeared off in the distance, and suddenly everyone was making way for them. Dongchen and his people were coming over. Birds of a feather flocked together. The people beside Dongchen were all outstanding cultivators from Dali Academy. "Brother, Your Majesty," said Dongchen to Yin Yuan and Li Sun. Li Yao and the others all bowed. "Daily Mountain is coming here on this day to seek the path. Make sure to prepare well," said Yin Yuan. "Yes, sir." Dongchen took a polite step backward. Someone said, "I heard that Hao Di of Daily Mountain will one day be named King of the West. King Tiandao has adopted him, so he must be a stunning figure. It will truly be amazing when he gets here to seek the path." Brother Dongchen is full of learning. At the year-end sparring session last year, he took first place. I am very excited about the battle between him and the future King of the West. The disciples of Dali Academy were naturally full of confidence in Dongchen. Dali Academy would definitely win this battle. "I'm excited too," came a voice from outside. Everyone saw a black-robed figure walking in, with many people following him. When this person entered, there was an invisible aura all around. Everyone felt bursts of pressure. How can an elder of the Chao clan have time to come here today? Asked Li Sun with a smile. The one who had come was a cultivator of the Chao clan's demonic clan. He was an unblemished saint of the Chao clan. His name was Chao Zhan and he was extremely powerful. This is a battle of the greatest figures below the saint level in the Dali dynasty, so naturally, I brought some of my juniors along to open up their eyes, said Chao Zhan. It seems that several members of the imperial family are here as well? Your juniors must be eager to get involved. Do they want to step onto the platform? Asked Li Sun with a smile. There are a few youngsters in the Chao clan who aren't bad, said Chao Zhan heartily. But they're nothing compared to Dong Chun and Di Hao. It seems that you have a clear understanding of your weaknesses, said Yin Yuan. Chao Zhan looked at Yin Yuan and said, I'm not looking to fight with you here at this sparring session for the youngsters. Please sit, said Yin Yuan. Chao Zhan stepped forward and took his seat. As for his juniors, they could only stand below him. Sword Mountain has come to greet Dali Academy, came a voice from outside. Soon a group of swordsmen entered. The shadow-bearing sword saint was leading them, but the disciples of Dali Academy were paying attention to the young swordsman behind him. He was clothed in black and standing there calmly with no aura coming off of him. It was as if he did not exist, but he still gave people a strong sense of threat. He was one of the juniors of Sword Mountain, at the extreme of what was possible below the saint level. He was someone who was often mentioned in the same breath as Dongchan Jianwu. Sword Mountain had been invited to Dali Academy, but Jianwu had received a personal invitation to take part in the sparring session. The foremost figure of the Dali lower world's seventh swordsman had also been brought here by the imperial advisor's disciple Lu Chuan. It seems that the top figures of the Dali dynasty are all here today, said Li Sun with a smile. Beside him, Yin Yuan pointed out a seat and said, Please be seated. The shadow-bearing sword saint and the other elders of Sword Mountain took their seats, and their juniors stood beside them as they continued to wait. The important faction today was Daily Mountain, and they had not arrived yet. When Yi Futian arrived, he was much more low-key than the Chao clan and Sword Mountain. He had come with Li Yang and Li Yu. King Li had been garrisoned in the lower worlds for a long time, and his power was unmatched down there. But his influence in the upper worlds was relatively weak. After Yi Futian had arrived, the shadow-bearing sword saint's gaze fell upon him. Yuan Gang, who had once lost to Yi Futian, was also there. He said something quietly into the dark-clothed man's ear. Jianwu's gaze turned to Yi Futian, and his eyes were as sharp as swords. But in a flash he turned his gaze away. However, Yi Futian still felt it. But he did not look over at him. He just followed Li Yu into the crowd. Your Highness, sir. Li Yang and Li Yu bowed slightly to Li Xian and Yin Yuan. Li Yang, Li Yu, said Li Sun with a smile. You are becoming more and more beautiful, Li Yu. It seems like I will have to talk to your father when I have a chance and see if we can find a suitable family for a match. Even though they were of the same generation when it came to cultivating, there was a significant gap in their ages. Li Sun, Li Yao, Li Xian, Li Yu, and many others were all of the same generation, but Li Sun was older than them all. He was their elder brother, and kind of their elder. Moreover, he was prince, but by the way he spoke, he seemed very familiar with them. You must be joking, Your Highness. I'm serious, said Li Sun with a smile. He looked at Yi Futian beside her and said, This must be seventh swordsman. Seventh swordsman of the lower worlds greets you, Your Highness, said Yi Futian with a bow. He naturally had seen that Li Yao was there, but he did not look at him as if he was a stranger. Right now he was seventh swordsman, not Yi Futian, who had come for vengeance. If he wanted revenge, he would have to be patient. He had created the identity of seventh swordsman from the lower worlds with great difficulty, so he could not so quickly reveal himself. I heard that you defeated all the geniuses of the 9 commanderies of Great Li. That is very good. Before you came to Dali Academy seeking the path. And now there is a battle of top talents here. You should observe it closely, said Li Sun. Yi Futian nodded. All right. Li Sun said nothing else. Li Yu and the others stepped back. But at that moment, Li Xian said coldly, Li Yang, Li Yu, it seems that you have ignored what I said last time. Li Yu turned and looked back at Li Xian. Seventh swordsman is my friend. Your friend, said Li Xian coldly. You must have forgotten that I am your brother. Li Xian, it seems that you learned nothing from last time, yelled Li Suan. Li Xian suddenly bowed his head. Do not forget yourself again, said Li Suan. Li Xian nodded. Yes, sir. The disciple of Daily Mountain has come to seek the path. A voice came shaking heaven and earth. Everyone suddenly looked up into the distance. The sound of footsteps seemed to come from far away, but a few moments later, everyone saw a group of figures coming towards them. These people had supernatural auras. They walked in good order, all in uniform, and all of them were light and carefree. Their manner showed how extraordinary they were. Dong Chen and his entourage walked out of the crowd and looked towards the figures that were coming. Their opponents had arrived. Many people had come from Daily Mountain, and the one at their head had a powerful aura. He was a saint who had cultivated to be very powerful. They walked to the front of the platform, then stopped and swept their gazes over the seats. They bowed slightly and said, Greetings, Your Highness. Many people had come from Daily Mountain, and the one at their head had a powerful aura. He was a saint who had cultivated to be very powerful. They walked to the front of the platform, then stopped and swept their gazes over the seats. They bowed slightly and said, Greetings, Your Highness. Today you have come here to take part in the sparring session. We are just here to watch, so there is no need to be so polite. Don't worry about us, said Li Sun with a smile. Dali Academy and Daily Mountain were the two strongest holy lands in the Dali dynasty. He was also looking forward to the battle between these two vast holy lands. It would undoubtedly be marvelous. At that moment, Lu Sun's gaze fell upon a young man who was standing among the crowd. He was standing up straight and tall and was looking forward calmly. No emotion could be seen in his bright and clear eyes. They were as calm and still as water. However, even so, the people in the crowd took notice of him as soon as they saw him. Some people had this kind of quality that even when they were in a crowd, everyone would look at them. Di Hao of Daily Mountain was said to be the strongest person in the Dali dynasty below the saint level, and he had cultivated himself to be infinitesimally close to the saint plane. The cultivators of Daily Mountain greet our brothers on the path from Dali Academy. The cultivators from Daily Academy may have come seeking the path, but they still expressed themselves very politely. Not a trace of arrogance or taunting could be seen from them. It was as if they had just come to pay a visit. You are all so polite. Please sit. Yin Yuan pointed out the seats for the cultivators from Daily Mountain. The elders of Daily Mountain took their seats, while Di Hao and the other youths remained standing. They had come to seek the path, not a banquet. The disciples of Dali Academy were also standing. They would not sit either. The imperial advisor is coming, said Li Sun. From far away, they could see another group of figures coming. In the crowd, Yi Futian also looked up. Among the group of people who were coming were Lu Chuan, who he had seen before. But this time Lu Chuan was standing behind someone else. He was a middle-aged man wearing sky-blue robes. His face was square and even, and there was no strong sense of majesty coming off him, making him seem like an elegant and refined person. But even though there was no aura bursting from him, one could still feel that he had a strong spirit within him. Everyone sitting in their seats rose, even the princes Li Yao and Li Sun and the great figures from the top forces. All of them bowed to him. The disciples of Dali Academy and Daily Mountain naturally did the same, and they respectfully called out to the one who was coming, Greetings, Imperial Advisor. No matter if you liked him or not, no matter if you sympathized with him or not, as soon as you saw this middle-aged man, you could do nothing but bow respectfully and call out his name. He had not been born into the imperial family, but he stood at the peak of the Dali dynasty and was said only to be subject to one person. Moreover, even if you didn't like him, you had to admit that he had worked his heart out for the Dali dynasty. He had bent his mind and skill towards training people. He was even basically responsible for carrying out the Battle of Empty Realm. This middle-aged man was indeed the top figure in Emperor Li's realm. Dali Academy alone had trained countless top cultivators. Before he had come to the Dali dynasty, Yi Futian had heard a lot of rumors about him in the Battle of Empty Realm. Many in Emperor Xia's realm even said that he was a strange and evil man who practiced dark magic. But since coming to Dali, All he had seen and heard was the absolute admiration that people in both the upper and lower worlds had for him. Even the princes of Dali Imperial City bowed to him when they saw him. King Tiandao's household was not at peace with the imperial advisor, but the people of Dali Mountain still had to show respect when they saw him. This was what he had seen of the imperial advisor in the Dali dynasty. He had wondered what kind of person this man, who stood at the peak of the Dali dynasty, was. Perhaps only those who stood beside him could truly know anything about him. The imperial advisor walked to his seat and bowed slightly to Li Sun and the others, saying, "May I be seated, Your Highness?" "Please," said Li Sun politely. The imperial advisor was not a stickler about where he sat, and so Li Sun and the others always left him several possible places of honor at the center. After he sat, the imperial advisor looked at the vast sparring field before him. With only a glance, he gave everyone there a strange feeling. It was as if he were looking directly at them. Everyone had this same feeling, and Yi Futian was no exception. There are many holy lands for cultivating in Dali Dynasty, but few of them are in contact with each other. Today Dali Mountain has come seeking the path, and this is a good thing. Thus, I have invited many people from Dali Imperial City and Sword Mountain to come and witness the sparring session, said the imperial advisor. For the vast majority of people there are boundaries to cultivation, and once you have reached a certain level, it is difficult to move forward. You can only wait for your juniors to overtake you. I hope that the juniors of the Dali dynasty can continue to surpass their elders. As a member of the Dali dynasty, seeing so many outstanding juniors gathered here for this sparring session soothes my heart. If you all can keep coming to seek the path in the future, that would be a beautiful thing. When you spar with each other, you can see your weaknesses, scrutinize yourself, and then keep moving forward. Today I will choose a disciple from among those sparring here. Of course, if he is not willing, I will not force him. I now give you all time to yourselves. And on saying this he said no more. In reality, all the disciples of both Dali Academy and Dali Mountain were outstanding people, and all of them were at the sage level. There were many things that their elders didn't need to do. Here all they had to do was observe. These disciples would do very well on their own. At that moment, a figure walked out of the group of disciples of Dali Mountain. There was a fierce expression on his face. He wanted to look even more dangerous than Dihao. His eyes were as sharp as knives, and he gave off a pressing aura. But this aura was not too strong. When he released his rule power, everyone could feel that he had only cultivated up to the lower sage level. But he was undoubtedly at the peak of that plane. I am Kuang Shao of Dali Mountain. I have no name of my own, as found on the battlefield, and brought back by the army. The king gave me my name as my father probably died in battle. The youth looked at the disciples of Dali Academy. In this life, most of my time has been spent either cultivating or in battle. I have killed many enemies, and have snatched victory from the jaws of defeat many times. The disciples of Dali Academy cultivate here in the city, reading books. Yet, they receive the respect of the masses, and enjoy many cultivation resources, even though they have rarely experienced the threat of death. This is because no one dares to do anything against them. Thus, I wish to test if my cultivation methods are better, or if those of Dali Academy are better. Kuang Zhao's dashing spirit was carried in his voice, and he did not hide his talent. Even the bit of aura that he was projecting was extremely wild. Unlike Dali Mountain, Dali Academy was located in a city. Thus the environment that the disciples of Dali Academy lived in was indeed much more peaceful. And each disciple of the academy was relatively famous, with everyone knowing about them. In contrast, the cultivators of Dali Mountain, which was located in the west, often faced death on the battlefield, and yet few in the Dali dynasty knew their names. Only Dihao attracted anyone's attention. This diatribe that Kuang Shao had launched against the disciples of Dali Academy was calling Dali Academy itself into question, as well as the imperial advisor's ideas. In some sense, Dali Mountain's attitude was King of the West Tiandao's attitude. Li Sun looked at Kuang Shao. His kingly uncle seemed to want to prove something by this sparring session. The cultivators of Dali Academy talked among themselves quietly, and then a mighty and powerful figure walked out from their midst. That is Qian Shan, who has been called the most talented student of rhythmic sorcery in Dali Academy, Liu told Yi Futian. Dali Academy naturally did not only have top-level sages, it had cultivators of all levels. And Qian Shan was an extremely powerful lower-level sage. After he had stepped forward, Qian Shan bowed to the crowd, then looked towards Kuang Shao and said, "The great path is long. There is no weakest person on it, just those who are better suited and those who are less suited. Reading leads to cultivation, as does killing enemies on the field of battle. There is no distinction about which is better. Moreover, we do not receive cultivation resources and the respect of the masses just because we are disciples of Dali Academy. Anytime the Dali dynasty needs us, we can go to war. In last year's Battle of Empty Realm, Brother Yuan Jin died on the field of battle." Everyone nodded slightly. Qian Shan's argument was outstanding. "You may say there is no distinction about which is better, but there is," said Kuang Shao. His wild aura swept out from him. Qian Shan nodded. "Please." He knelt on the vast sparring field, and a Guqin spirit appeared. He began to pluck the Guqin, and the notes resonated. The melody was warm and calm, seemingly able to calm the anger of a human heart. Kuang Zhao's life spirit blossomed, and the figure an impossibly giant beast appeared behind him, full of ferocity and anger. It was the vicious beast Tao. A suffocating pressure swept across the sparring field, and Kuang Shao suddenly stepped forward. The ground trembled continuously. He seemed to be one with Tao, having transformed into a beast of war as he charged at Qian Shan. Qian Shan continued plucking the Guqin strings, and the notes resonated with heaven and earth. Suddenly an invisible force pierced through everything, as the musical sorcery turned into invisible power and shot towards Kuang Shao and Tao, slowing them down considerably. Hearing the music, Yi Futian felt that the worldly rules had been infected by it. It seemed that in that area, everything would only move according to the music. Even those watching on the sidelines had an illusion that their perception and movements had been slowed. Kuang Shao will probably lose, thought Yi Futian. Although he was very wild, and his combat ability was very high, Qian Shan's music could control him. Moreover, as a disciple of Dali Academy, Qian Shan's rule spells would certainly not be weak. Sure enough, a snowstorm seemed to appear along with the trembling notes. The temperature plummeted, and waves began to crash towards his opponent. The whole area seemed to have turned into a sea world, and the watery prison affected Kuang Zhao's movements. As soon as Kuang Shao had stepped forward, the disciples of Dali Academy must have guessed that he was good at close combat. Kuang Zhao's attack was extremely brutal. Even if it was being sealed by frost and bound by the water prison, it continued its wild attack toward the other. With his body as the center, many giant Tao appeared, rushing forward and tearing away at the frosty seal. At this moment his body seemed to be fused with the Tao, and this incredibly violent war beast stood in front of Qian Shan. Its sharp claws clamped down, trying to destroy and vanquish this space. Kuang Zhao's attack was extremely brutal. Even if it was being sealed by frost and bound by the water prison, it continued its wild attack toward the other. With his body as the center, many giant Tao appeared, rushing forward and tearing away at the frosty seal. At this moment his body seemed to be fused with the Tao, and this incredibly violent war beast stood in front of Qian Shan. Its sharp claws clamped down, trying to destroy and vanquish this space. Qian Shan sat quietly. In this space of illusion he seemed to be at the bottom of the ocean. He did not look up, only stroking the strings, and the musical notes turned into ripples of sound waves, rushing into the ears of Kuang Shao. The closer he got to Qian Shan, the stronger the power that oscillated, rocking his entire will so that everything in front of him seemed somewhat blurred. But even so, it was impossible to stop him from continuing his attacks. The water waves roared upon Qian Shan, and a water dragon encircled around his body, moving upward, and then rushed to the war beast and entangled the body of the other, which blocked Kuang Zhao's attack. Along with a violent shock, their two bodies were simultaneously slammed backward. Kuang Shao is on the verge of defeat, many exclaimed inside their hearts. The technique of Qian Shan's music was able to weaken Kuang Zhao's combat ability continuously. At the beginning of the battle was when Kuang Shao had the most chance to win. Still, as that attack did not overcome his opponent, the likelihood of another opportunity later in the fight was slight. As expected by everyone, the battle lasted quite a long time. Qian Shan's musical spell defended Kuang Zhao's violent attacks until Kuang Zhao was weakened to his eventual defeat by Qian Shan. Much obliged. Qian Shan collected the Guqing spirit, got up, and bowed to the cultivators of Daily Mountain, then returned among the disciples of the Dali Academy. Kuang Zhao's face was icy, and there were bloodstains at the corners of his mouth. He also returned to the people of Daily Mountain. Did you understand? Among the crowd of Daily Mountain, next to Di Hao, a young man looked at Kuang Zhao and asked. Kuang Zhao bowed his head. On the battlefield, if defeated, it often meant death. He was the first one of the Daily Mountain to battle, therefore the defeat was particularly shameful. On the battlefield you were brave enough to face thousands, rushing into the army without hesitation. But from the very beginning, Qian Shan of Dali Academy restricted your ability. His musical talent was superb, and his spells extraordinary. Even though you possessed immensely strong offensive powers, it was still difficult for you to fully exert your power. After you return to Daily Mount, you should self-reflect. Empty courage ultimately will achieve nothing. In addition to the trials of life and death, more studying is needed. The young man continued to lecture. Many people looked with surprise at the young man. From what he had said, it seemed that the battle was just a trial for the disciples of Daily Mountain, not a real battle to seek the way. He had used this battle to teach Kuang Zhao, a disciple of Daily Mountain. Yes, senior brother. Kuang Zhao bowed his head. He seemed to be extremely respectful to the young man. The young man stepped forward and suddenly, the eyes of all the disciples of the Dali Academy fell on him. The affectation of the young man was even more extraordinary than Kuang Zhao, and he was about half a head taller. He was clad in all black and his eyes, though calm, were extremely deep. This person stood next to Di Hao among the disciples of the Daily Mountain, and from this alone, one could detect his status. Presumably he was mighty. 7 Sins of Daily Mountain, swordsman of the Peak of Sage Plain. Half step into Saint Plain, pleased to meet you. The moment his voice fell, an invisible sword will instantly envelop the entire platform, cold and sharp. Although he was still standing there calmly, there was an extreme sense of danger coming out of him. The faces of the disciples of Dali Academy were darkened. Clearly this person was very powerful. Moreover, when he introduced himself, he bluntly declared that he was a swordsman, half step into Saint Plain. This was a kind of self-confidence. He informed everyone of his level of cultivation. He released the atmosphere so the other party could perceive it, allowing Dali Academy to choose the next person to answer the battle call. Even the eyes of those from Sword Mountain were focused on this person who walked out. Many of the swordsmen in training wore a grave look on their faces. From the sword will that was released from the other, they had felt an authoritative pressure of sword way. 7 Sins, swordsman in training. This was a cultivator who did not enjoy any fame in Dali Imperial City. Before now, almost no one had heard of his existence. Never mind him. Even Di Hao was only known because of his adopted father, King Tiandao. The people of Dali focused on Dali Academy way more than they did Daily Mountain, especially inside this imperial city. Dali Academy had countless cultivators, which was a conglomeration of all the elites of Dali. Naturally, some were half-step into the Saint Plain. If Di Hao did not answer the call of battle clearly, Dongchan would not either. Otherwise, who could battle Di Hao? At this time, a disciple from Dali Academy stepped out. He was wearing a golden shirt and seemed very thin. When he stepped onto the platform, the sword will released from 7 Sins could be felt, yet his footsteps were steady. A ray of golden light permeated from him, and there seemed to be a strange rhythm that rocked the invisible space, which gradually turned into a strong pressure, sweeping toward 7 Sins. Zuozong. Many were not surprised to see the appearance of this person. In Dali Academy, Dongchan and Zuozong were the closest to Saint Plain. At the most recent battle form at Dali Academy, Dongchan was first, and Zuozong was second. Zuozong, a disciple of the Dali Academy, pleased to meet you, Zuozong said. As his voice fell, the golden robe fluttered without wind, and a suffocating pressure shrouded the forum platform. At this instant, although the two had not yet made any exchanges, they were already competing with their aura. and the airflow on the platform became extremely agitated. Even the cultivators around them could feel that suffocating pressure. The sword will was madly condensing, and everyone could see violent currents of sword wei gathering in front of Seven Sins, making sharp and harsh sounds. It was followed by a sword, suspended in front of him, humming. This sword looked to be greedily devouring of the currents of sword wei that rose between heaven and earth. The sword itself was extremely thin, but there was a terrible texture carved upon it, puffing out shocking radiance. Many people of Sword Mountain showed a sharpness in their eyes. Their expression now mirrored that of a sharp sword. Even the shadow-bearing sword saint was moved slightly. Sword of Kasayapa, shadow-bearing sword saint said. Suddenly, many of the powerful principles people were stunned. The name of the sword of Kasayapa originated from a Kasayapa sword saint many years ago, whose sword wei was unparalleled. He was known as the first person of the Dali sword wei. Later, the Kasayapa sword saint had gone missing, and the sword of Kasayapa never surfaced again. Now, could the sword in the hand of Seven Sins be the sword of Kasayapa? The sword was thin as a leaf, and indeed the shape of a leaf could be faintly detected. Although it was extremely thin, its sword will was astounding. First sword, Seven Sins spat, and the sword shot out like a light. It disappeared in a flash. Zhuozong apparently also perceived the strength of the other. He released his life spirit, and suddenly a golden brilliance flowed upon his torso. A huge golden shadow covering him, just like an ancient golden god. Dong! A loud bang rocked the void and let out a roar, and a terrible storm swept out and turned into countless golden spears. However, the sword penetrated directly and split one of the golden spears down the middle, but did not touch the other spears. It continued the forward momentum towards Zhuozong, as fast as light. The huge golden palm of Zhuozong lifted up and slammed toward the sword. It was like the waves of a storm, and even the void trembled. However, that sword was far too thin. As if there was nowhere to exert the force, it directly pierced into the golden palm print, and penetrated it bit by bit. It came out from the back of the palm, continuing to stab towards Zhuozong. On the golden body of Zhuozong, brilliant golden lines also appeared, and a clear sound was heard. Terrible shockwaves swept out, but in the face of this terrible storm, the sword still stabbed toward that golden torso, penetrating bit by bit. Halfway it was finally blocked. The disciples of the Dali Academy looked grave. Zhuozong's offensive and defensive skills were considered unparalleled below the Saint Plane, but the sword of his opponent actually penetrated him halfway. Zhuozong wanted to grab onto the sword with his left hand but saw that the sword instantly exited, like a golden streaming light. It then wrapped around and twirled above Zhuozong's body. Many people look at Seven Sins again. He was controlling the sword. Not only that, but a second sword appeared in front of him. Second sword. As his voice fell, the sword struck again. It once again went towards Zhuozong. At the same time, the first sword also started to move back. The two swords simultaneously cutting the body of the ancient god that was summoned by Zhuozong, tearing it apart little by little. Dong! A loud noise seemed to rock heaven and earth. Zhuozong stepped out, allowing the swords to cut at him while he continued walking towards Seven Sins. A golden arm smashed towards Seven Sins. When his foot stepped down, there was a pressure of the way that covered this space and oppressed the void. Seven Sins stood indifferently. He looked up and glanced at the arm that was slamming toward him. Sword will surrounded his body, tearing the void. In an instant, Seven Sins broken through the sky, as if ignoring the pressure, and his body disappeared. Then the body of the Seven Sins appeared above Zhuozong. The way of the space. The sword of Kasayapa could only be cultivated by those who specialized in the way of the space. The third sword. In front of Seven Sins, the third sword of Kasayapa stabbed forward. Upon the immense body of Zhuozong, suddenly, there appeared many golden arms, grabbing toward the void at the same time. The figure of Seven Sins disappeared once more, like a golden afterimage, shuttling upon the platform. His spiritual willpower was released to the extreme. While dodging, he still controlled the swords that cut at the body of Zhuozong without ceasing. The disciples of the Dali Academy looked serious. If this continued, Zhuozong would be defeated. As they expected, when the sword of Kasayapa manifested the 13th time, A terrible storm of the sword of Cassiopeia started around Zhuozong. His huge golden battle form was now being slashed and shattered, slowly being destroyed. Soon, even the incomparably sturdy body of the ancient god could no longer be sustained, and its body collapsed and shattered. The 13 swords surrounded Zhuozong's body. The sword wool was covering the sky. The body of 7 sins suspended in the sky, still looking indifferent. Zhuozong of the Dali Academy had been defeated. Many looked up at 7 sins, who was in the void. It was unexpected that besides Di Hao, there still existed such a strong person. So, just how strong was Di Hao? Even if Yi Futian's eyes while looking at 7 sins changed somewhat, the one who stood at the peak of Dali was indeed extraordinary. I didn't expect the sword of Cassiopeia, which had been lost for a long time, to appear here today. It was certainly worth the trip, Shadow-bearing Sword Saint said. Could he compete with Jianwu? Asked Li Sun. He certainly could. Shadow-bearing Sword Saint nodded, and everyone looked at 7 sins. Jianwu was praised as the first swordsman of Dali under the Saint Plane, the first disciple of Sword Mountain. 7 sins could compete with him. This demonstrated the formidable strength of 7 sins. Today's forum battle has gotten even more interesting. I didn't know if we would be seeing the sword battle of the younger generation of Dali, to see the sword of Sword Mountain compete with the sword of Cassiopeia. The shadow-bearing Sword Saint looked at Jianwu and then looked at Yi Futian. The Sword Mountain had come to Emperor Li's city to fulfill a contract to allow Jianwu to descend the mountain and to defeat the 7th swordsman, so he could cultivate at Sword Mountain. Now there was also a peak swordsman in Daily Mountain and the appearance of the long-lost sword of Cassiopeia. Li Sun noticed the gaze of the shadow-bearing Sword Saint and suddenly looked at Yi Futian, saying, I almost forgot that this trip of the Sword Mountain was to come for the 7th swordsman. 7th swordsman is the first swordsman from the lower worlds. What is your opinion of the sword of 7 sins? Many people looked at Yi Futian. At this moment it was the first time that many top figures of Dali had truly noticed Yi Futian. Among them, there was the advisor of Dali and the royal prince of Dali. Many people looked at Yi Futian. At this moment it was the first time that many top figures of Dali had truly noticed Yi Futian. Among them, there was the advisor of Dali and the royal prince of Dali. Yi Futian's eyes fell on Li Sun, and he saw that Li Yao, who was next to Li Sun, was also looking at him. However, Li Yao would not know who he was or for whom he came for. Once upon a time in the 9 states, Li Yao caused Jieyu's death and also caused the death of many in the 9 states. In the empty realm, Li Yao forced him to react after he was defeated. Yaya and senior brother were both seriously injured. Both of them and Wuxian almost died in the battle. If it weren't for the sword from the swordmaster of Lihan that allowed Yi Wuxian to block the attack, the consequences would have been unimaginable. Therefore he came to Dali. There were some things that he needed to do. If it was merely relying on cultivation to kill Li Yao, and judging from Li Yao's status, when would that be? But even though his heart was full of hatred, his eyes were calm and without disturbance. He did not cast so much as a sideways glance at Li Yao. He merely focused on Li Sun and said, the way of the sword was outstanding, and its power was truly amazing. When many heard what Yi Futian had to say, they secretly agreed. 7 sins was indeed outstanding. This man himself had once come to the Dali Academy, also seeking instruction. He was now known as the first person of the Dali lower realm. He must have been quite extraordinary himself. However, this time, Jianwu of the Sword Mountain and 7 sins were both present. There were also Dongqian and Di Hao, 2 peak characters, so there wouldn't be much required of him. However, it was still an opportunity to observe and learn. Li Sun nodded with a smile and said, today is a rare opportunity. Sword Mountain came because of you. There are also 2 great young swordsmen in training at their peak. A great way to sharpen your sword way. You can ask them for instruction later. I do not agree with your highness, Yi Futian said. Why? Asked Li Sun. Your highness said that Jianwu and 7 sins are the great young swordsmen of Dali. Though the first sword of Sword Mountain and the sword of 7 sins are strong, they may not necessarily be at the peak. The sword of 7 sins had fatal flaws. If your highness wanted to talk about the peak sword way below the Saint Plane, then I ought to be included, Yi Futian said. Oh. Hearing his words, Li Sun showed a look of surprise. All witnessed the force of Seven Sins' sword. He had realized the way of the space and integrated it into the sword. The power of the sword of Kasyapa was unparalleled. But the seventh swordsman claimed that the sword of Seven Sins had fatal flaws. Many who knew the name of the seventh swordsman had heard that his entire mind was bent on seeking the way of the sword. His behavior was quite arrogant, and he thought that his sword way was the one and only. It seemed that this was indeed the case. He had come alone to seek the way from Dali Academy. He had just witnessed the sword of Seven Sins in action, but he was now saying that there were imperfections in the sword of Seven Sins. The seventh swordsman felt that he ought to be the person at the peak of the sword way. However, in the eyes of most people present today, the seventh swordsman, though outstanding in his own right, he was bound to be at some distance from the few who were at the peak of the Dali upper realm. Li Sun did not deny Yi Futian's claim but said, "If so, let me witness your sword. How about it?" Yi Futian looked toward Li Sun. The status of Li Sun as the royal prince of the Saint Plain was no lesser than Li Yao. "Since your highness wishes to see, I will oblige," Yi Futian responded. He stepped forward and looked at Seven Sins in the crowd of Daily Mountain. He called out, "The seventh swordsman in training, ask for instruction in the way of the sword." Seven Sins cast a glance at Yi Futian. He did not recognize who he was. He came here today for Dali Academy, and this person just critiqued his sword as having fatal flaws. He naturally relegated it as nonsense. Seven Sins looked at Yi Futian. He did not speak and did not step out. Many eyes were looking toward the direction of Daily Mountain, falling on Seven Sins. For a time this space was rather silent. Seven Sins did not respond to the call of battle, not because he dared not to. His eyes were casual and calm, and he moved his sight away. It was as if he had not heard anything Yi Futian said. The cultivators of the Daily Mountain, likewise, glanced at Yi Futian. No one spoke. The silent space was like a silent jeer. Yi Futian dared to criticize that the sword of Seven Sins, so it was understandable that the people of Daily Mountain would eschew all etiquette on that account. The silence at the moment was a statement. Not just anyone could ask Seven Sins of Daily Mountain for a fight. Seven Sins did not care to move his little finger. Many people felt uncomfortable in this slightly embarrassing atmosphere. This first swordsman from the lower worlds was obviously not quite up to par. Even if he had personally asked for Seven Sins to instruct the way of the sword, he was ignored by Seven Sins. Those in power felt the embarrassing atmosphere of the forum, but they did not speak, just watching Yi Futian. How would this swordsman in training handle the situation? Li Sun looked at Yi Futian. His face changed slightly. This embarrassing situation would make Yi Futian feel he was losing face. Shadow-bearing Sword Saint was thinking whether or not to ask Jian Wu to step out instead to resolve the impasse. This seventh swordsman was dedicated to seeking the way of the sword, and his speech was quite arrogant. The unparalleled in the lower worlds also had the right to be arrogant. It was only that in the upper worlds, among the top figures here, it was inevitable that this attitude would suffer some disadvantage. However, with the right challenges and trials, great achievement was a definite outcome. Of course, Yi Futian knew that he was being ignored, but he did not feel anything out of the ordinary when he saw the reaction of the people of Daily Mountain. Being ignored was, in itself, quite within expectation. After all, this was one of the two strongest holy lands to cultivate in Dali Imperial City, and Seven Sins was someone who stood at the top. Seventh swordsman in training asks Daily Mountain for instruction of the way, Yi Futian continued, and this time, he was not asking for Seven Sins only. Instead, he was asking Daily Mountain. In other words, anyone from Daily Mountain would suffice. The people of Daily Mountain glanced at him and saw Yi Futian standing there. His body stood tall. It seemed as if he had not felt any shame whatsoever. After being ignored the first time, he was still insisting. In the direction of Daily Mountain, a burly figure walked out. It was a cultivator of the sage plane of Daily Mountain. Today, it was Daily Mountain asking Dali Academy for instruction, not an occasion for Yi Futian to cause trouble. However, since he had affected them, they had to clean it up. Dong! The cultivator who came out did not announce himself, but merely stepped right out, and released a terrible force. "Are you ready?" asked Yi Futian. Get it on, the other responded coldly. Yi Futian's palm stretched out, and suddenly Sword Will started whistling. It surrounded him and gathered into a massive sword in front of him. This heavy sword rotated in front of Yi Futian, whistling and humming, and its breath was getting stronger and stronger with terrible power. The force that came out of it contained a strong sense of annihilation. A few cultivators of Daily Mountain expressed a stern look. This person did not seem to be weak. Raising his palm, Yi Futian reached out and clasped the end of the sword, and then pushed the sword forward with breakneck speed. Loud noises whistled. The Daily Mountain cultivator suddenly lunged forward with both palms extended forward, and a golden pattern appeared in front of him immediately. Yi Futian came with the sword, and his palm pressed toward the front. As the sword arrived, the loud roaring noise came out, and instantly the golden pattern exploded and was pulverized. The heavy sword continued its movement forward. The cultivator let out an angry roar. His face changed slightly and he stepped out once again. His life spirit was released, and a huge golden behemoth appeared. The strength of both palms like a hurricane blasted out fiercely. Yi Futian ignored the attempt of the other, and his palm continued to push the heavy sword. Everything shattered and exploded, and the body of the other continued to backpedal. He let out sounds of frustrated exertion and it was still useless. His feet ground against the floor and the clothing on his arms were shredded. Blue veins on his arms were bulging. The sounds of friction could be heard as if his bones were about to be crushed. Yi Futian did not deal a fatality. He had folded one hand behind him, using only his right hand pushing forward, oppressing the other with the ease of a stroll. Enough! A voice was heard, and Yi Futian stopped to turn his head, looking toward the direction of Daily Mountain. Over there, Seven Sins walked out and looked at Yi Futian. His expression was as sharp as a sword. Clearly, this battle made him feel that Yi Futian possessed incredible strength. Yi Futian let go of the opponent, and the sword disappeared. He went to Seven Sins and the two stood face to face. "My sword, what's wrong with it?" asked Seven Sins. "Are you ready?" Yi Futian asked the same as he had before. Seven Sins frowned and replied yes. He needed no preparation. Around him, the sword will shot to the sky, and the sword of Cassiopeia was condensing. But as he was concentrating on forming the sword, Yi Futian's body turned into a stream of light, and Seven Sins felt that he was locked down by spiritual power. Yi Futian had a sword in his hand, a common-looking sword. But when the sword struck, a horrible storm that came between heaven and earth appeared. It was as if everywhere it passed, everything would be crushed. So fast. Everyone blinked, and then they saw the sword will of Seven Sins coursing out. His body seemed to disappear. It was like a light that moved in and out of thin air. However, in the next moment, everyone's pupils contracted. They saw that Yi Futian had also disappeared. In the void, Yi Futian's sword was still swinging. This sword seemed to have accompanied him traversing the void, and was aimed directly at Seven Sins. The sword will around Seven Sins was extremely powerful, and it madly screamed toward Yi Futian for the kill. But Yi Futian was also surrounded by an equally terrible sword storm. Buzz! Seven Sins once again disappeared from where he was standing. Almost at the same time, everyone saw that Yi Futian had also disappeared. The pupils of everyone contracted and stared at the battlefield. They saw a sword. This sword seemed to be a sword from another dimension, appearing through the void so that there seemed to be a sword light crossing the space of the void. From that sword light, it seemed that the position of the two could be deciphered. All of this, in fact, happened in an instant, and there only seemed to be a sword that crossed heaven and earth. In the next instant, two figures appeared at the same time. Yi Futian stood in the void, but Seven Sins appeared on the forum platform. The sword in his hand was broken. Seven Sins looked somewhat bewildered at the sword that had not yet formed, and his face was slightly pale. Not only him, but many people around him trembled and watched the scene in front of them with shock. One sword strike. That beautiful scene in the void was just one sword strike. Seven Sins, the swordsman who stood at the peak of Dali, whose sword was cut in half by another. Those from Daily Mountain looked extremely concerned, and they looked up at Yi Futian. "I said, your flaw was too fatal," Yi Futian said. The sword of Cassiopeia was mighty and would get stronger as the battle went on. However, the sword of Cassiopeia needed the condensation of sword will. Obviously, he would not give Seven Sin the time to do so. In the first sword strike, he had immediately resolved the battle. But was it true that Seven Sin's sword contained fatal flaws? The answer was no. No cultivator in this world was perfect and without fault. No matter the ability of cultivation, there would always be weaknesses. Perhaps the only weakness of Seven Sins was that for the sword of Cassiopeia to be released, it required a significant amount of sword will to turn it into an invincible sword. The sword of Cassiopeia would get stronger and stronger. Before, when all 13 swords were deployed, even someone as strong as Wuzong of the Dali Academy was unable to resist. Moreover, he could be stronger still. But it did require some time for the sword will to condense, and did that matter? With the sword will that flowed upon Seven Sins, even if there was no sword of Cassiopeia, his offense and defense were still solid. Not to mention, he had incorporated spatial will and integrated it into the sword will so that it could tear the void in its progression. Previously, even Wuzong's might of the Great Path was unable to trap him. So, how could this be considered a fatal flaw? But at the moment, the seventh swordsman did not allow Seven Sins to strike with the sword. And before the sword of Cassiopeia could be unleashed, he had cut the formation of the sword short. Because the sword of the seventh swordsman was not any weaker than the sword of Cassiopeia, and he was also an expert in spatial will, by locking onto the body of Seven Sins, the sword broke through the void, hence the brilliant sword strike that everyone witnessed. If Seven Sin had time to gather multiple swords of Cassiopeia, it would be difficult to know who was strong and who was weak. But since the seventh swordsman could deter him from launching his sword, that itself proved that the way of the sword of the seventh swordsman was more convincing than that of Seven Sins. Excellent, Li Sun praised. Though there was only one strike through the sword, it was a superb one. Not only Li Sun, everyone around looked at Yi Futian with a slightly changed attitude. This first swordsman from the lower worlds with just one sword strike convinced all the top figures who were present to recognize his strength. Before, many had thought that this battle was to Yi Futian to seek the way to learn of the sword, and to observe the swords of Jianwu and Seven Sins. But obviously, the seventh swordsman was proving that his sword was not inferior to anyone, even if it was someone as strong as Seven Sins. As he said before to Li Sun, he ought to be included among those at the peak of swordsmanship below Saint Plain. Li Yu also looked at Yi Futian with some shock. Even though she knew that he was strong, she did not expect that he was this strong. Seven Sins was someone who had defeated Wuzong of the Dali Academy. When Yi Futian stepped out, he was ignored by the people of Daily Mountain. But then, when the two significant cultivators of Daily Mountain faced him, each was only able to release one single sword strike. Even at this moment, all the top figures of Dali who were present focused their attention on him. Jianwu, at this moment, the shadow-bearing sword saint spoke, "Your turn." In the direction of Sword Mountain, Jianwu's sight directed toward Yi Futian from a distance. He stepped forward. Shadow-bearing sword saint had asked him to fight some swordsmen from the lower worlds, and it was not something he was willing to do. However, the shadow-bearing sword saint was his elder, so he still obeyed. When he saw the sword of Seven Sins today, he thought that his opponent would be Seven Sins. But Yi Futian proved his worth with his sword, that he deserved in exchange. Jianwu walked out, and each of his steps contained a terrifying sword will. The swordsmanship clouding the sky and causing a sword storm of sword qi. Jianwu, the first disciple of Sword Mountain, the first sword below Saint in the Dali Imperial City. Seventh swordsman, the first person below Saint Plain in the lower worlds. Both of them used sword in their name. Jianwu's body levitated and appeared upon the void, standing opposite Yi Futian. With the sword will wrapped around him, and real physical swords bloomed between heaven and earth. This storm headed directly toward Yi Futian. However, Yi Futian was also protected by the same force, so the two storms of swordsmanship collided, and a truly suffocating might now filled this space. Some cultivators below the Saint Plain felt that if they came between the two, they may not be able to withstand the sword will and might be torn into pieces. At this time, Jianwu extended his palms, and suddenly in front of his palms, the sword will gathered, turning into swords, and transparent swords surrounded his body. Water of autumn, Jianwu said, and the sword broke through the sky and moved toward Yi Futian. On top of Yi Futian, burning flames hung high above the sky as a sun. His hand reached out and suddenly a sword gathered in his hand. A sword of burning flame. The sword unleashed, and fire dragons roared and burned through the void. Blazing sun, Yi Futian also commanded. And the two sword wills circled and colliding. Jianwu seemed not to have noticed, and the sword will once again condensed and gave rise to a sky full of swords. Between heaven and earth, there appeared a starry sky. Meteor. Jianwu pointed forward and suddenly, another sword broke through the sky, descending with meteor sword will. Yi Futian looked up at his surroundings, and there was another will of frost materializing around him. Hail, a voice commanded, and the sword of ice went toward the sword of meteor. Heaven and the earth seemed to be frozen, which blocked the meteor from falling. Jianwu's body floated in a forward movement. Both of his hands stretched out. Above the sky, a great and stunning sword will manifested everywhere. The moment, cued by the command, swords came out to attack, and the affectation of the moment was everywhere. Boom! Yi Futian took a step forward, and the sword whistled in the sky, and a storm of destruction raged. Storm! With the strike of the sword, the horrible storm of horror seemed to flood this space. Chijua Swordsmanship of Sword Mountain. All the cultivators of Dali gazed upon the battlefield. Chijua Swordsmanship used 7 kinds of sword wills to manifest and depended on each swordsman's cultivation. The results were not all the same, but Chijua Swordsmanship gradually increased in layers. Its power was shocking, and every time the sword struck, it was to gather sword force so that the sword strikes towards the end were more terrifying. Chijua Sword Realm contained all the swordsmanship. At the moment above the sky, there was an infinite number of sharp swords falling. In its succeeding gloom, this space had completely turned into a world of the swords. Jianwu's Chijua Sword Realm. All in all, Jianwu's eyes were extremely sharp, and from those eyes came a terrible light. Of the 7, 4 had already been dispersed. When the sword struck out, it turned into all and contained all. It was everywhere, omnipotent, and could destroy all. Above Yi Futian, a terrible thunderstorm exploded, sweeping the entire space, shattering all things. He stepped out again and this time went toward Jianwu. In the battle between swordsmen, the only way was forward, and there was no retreat. Thunder. Another sword emerged, and heaven and earth seemed to be destroyed by way of the sword. Thunder sword strikes smashed the void and cleaved open the great path. Densify. Jianwu's eyes turned into sword eyes, and inside his pupils, the space of the sword realm was reflected. Yi Futian only felt that this sword realm was unreal, just like a hell made of sword way. Heavy swords condensed and came into being, immense and incomparable. Each step he took shook the void. The heavy sword broke through the air, and blasted into all 8 directions of the land, suppressing the sword realm. The end of day. Jianwu unleashed the 6th sword, and the Chijua sword realm turned into real doomsday. The infinite sword will intended to pierce the sword realm and madly moved to attack Yi Futian. Yi Futian waved both hands, his feet upon the void, and sharp swords surrounded him. Infinity. Rolls of sword veil swung out, seemingly infinite, annihilating all swordsmanship. Everyone who was watching the battle looked at the scene of horror in the void, and many people trembled in their hearts. Was this the battle of the peak swordsmanship below the Saint Plain? Whether it was Jianwu or the 7th swordsman, they were both fearfully strong. But at this moment the 7th swordsman was shrouded by Chijua sword realm, and was significantly restricted by it. Even so, he was still able to block the 6th sword with his sword of incomparable aggression. However, the space seemed to be shattered and destroyed. How sharp would the next sword be? Just then Jianwu closed his eyes and seemed to have integrated into the sword realm, and his body was spinning. Suddenly the infinite sword will between heaven and earth gathered together, and merged into the sword realm. This entire sword realm seemed to be turning and crushed everything within. Funeral of the gods. A sharp voice came from inside the sword realm, and the sword will of destruction suddenly shattered the void. The funeral of the gods was precisely that. Even the gods would be buried in the Chijua sword realm. Yi Futian stared at this devastating storm. The sword realm buried all things and shattered all things. Even the clothes on his body were shredded. His swordsmanship seemed unable to defend this force. At the moment, the aura upon his body had already reached its peak, and the sword force of heaven and earth seemed to gather together. In this storm he held a sword, and with every step that was taken, the sword force was still climbing higher and strengthened further. There was a sword mark between heaven and earth, tearing up the void. Wherever Yi Futian passed, everything seemed to be pulverized. The storm became stronger, rushing toward him. Finally, Yi Futian's sword was unleashed. This sword would end all things. When the sword struck, a storm broke out, and his body moved with the sword, using the sword to tear apart the funerary storm. Sizzling sounds were heard, and the sword will madly teared and destroyed. The sword realm seemed to have been opened, and then tore apart bit by bit until the sword realm was fully opened. All saw that sword rocket upward like a sacred sword, a true sword strike that could cleft the sky in two. The sword light crossed the heaven and the earth, and a sword opened up the sky. With a loud boom, the storm of destruction raged between the sky and the earth, and the Qijua sword realm was broken. In the sword realm there came a groan. Jianwu flew out backward, and at the corner of his mouth, there was a streak of blood. The first person in the younger generation of Sword Mountain, the sharpest sword below Saint in the Dali dynasty, Jianwu, was defeated. Of course, he was no longer the strongest sword below Saint in Dali Imperial City. The seventh swordsman had replaced him. At this time the aura on Yi Futian's body was slightly shallow. Jianwu was already incredibly strong. But the final sword of end all appeared as one strike, but gathered the momentum of all the sword attacks before it. With his terrible power integrated within, along with the space-shredding rules, he had turned the end-all power of the halberd of time and space into the swordsmanship that would end all things. Therefore there was that beautiful sword strike opening the sword realm of the other. The shadow-bearing sword saint looked at Yi Futian speechless. For this arrogant but pure-hearted swordsman of the lower worlds, he had asked Jianwu to come down from the mountain to defeat him. But now, even Jianwu of Sword Mountain was defeated in battle. Just as the seventh swordsman had said, would this confirm that he learned from all things of the world to comprehend the swordsmanship of all things, which was more suitable than the swordsman of the Sword Mountain? Then why go to Sword Mountain at all? Could it be that this seeker's destiny was not with Sword Mountain after all? No one would have thought that the seventh swordsman from the lower worlds would triumph over the two mighty swordsmen Seven Sins and Jianwu. The young man who had come to the Dali Academy to seek instruction once upon a time now used these two battles to prove to the world that he was the first sword under the Dali dynasty. After this battle, below the Saint Plain, there is nothing more to ask regarding the swordsmanship. The road ahead can only be the divine path, Yi Futian said. Although the words sounded proud, they were the truth. He had reached the apex of the sword way below the Saint Plain in Dali. From now on, what lied in front of him could only be the divine path. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.